Hi there. Today, we're once again diving into a true crime case that happened right here in the U.S., one you might have never heard of. This story took place in Coral Gables, Florida. It's the case of Susan Sutton, with cruelty that goes beyond fiction. Listen closely to understand what really happened. She died in the very room that used to be the most peaceful place in the house. The cream-colored room with a window overlooking the backyard, where every morning Susan would draw the curtains, breathe in the early breeze, and watch the sunlight filtering through the trees. That room, now soaked in dark blood, cold and suffocatingly silent. That's where they found the body of Susan Sutton, lying motionless on the bed, her hands curled under the blanket pulled up to her chest, as if trying to shield something, or perhaps simply a final reflex before the bullet pierced through her. The blood soaked through the sheets, spreading onto the wooden floor. There were no signs of struggle, no cries for help, no broken doors. Everything was too quiet, too clean, too merciless, too... At the other end of the hallway, John Sutton, her husband, was slumped in a pool of blood, still breathing, still faintly moving. But blood streamed from his head and down his arm, a bullet wound through his face, rendering him blind. He had no idea what had happened, nor that his wife was dead, right inside the home they had lived in for over 25 years. A long trail of blood stretched from the bedroom to the front door. Not Susan's, but John's. He had tried to drag himself out, perhaps to seek help, or simply as a survival instinct. But he didn't make it. He collapsed on the floor, just a few steps from the landline. Police arrived after a 911 call at 10:53 p.m., a disjointed call, with only the faint whisper of a man gasping, "They shot me," followed by silence. When Coral Gables officers entered the scene, the first thing they saw was the hallway light flickering, a bulb replaced just days ago now blinking like it was burning out. Then they saw John, covered in blood, and Susan, no longer breathing. There were no signs of forced entry. Everything was tidy, as if someone had planned every step, as if someone knew the layout inside, and even the exact location of each bedroom. Susan slept in the southwest room, John in the southeast, separated by a hallway. The couple had slept in separate rooms for years due to John's chronic snoring, and that detail may have saved his life. No safe was pried open, no drawers were ransacked. Susan's wedding ring remained on her finger, and on the vanity sat an open jewelry box, with all valuables still inside. Initially, the police suspected a robbery, but if it was a robbery, why wasn't anything taken? If it was a stranger, how did they enter without a trace? And if it was just a stranger, how did they know exactly which room belonged to whom? The female victim was shot multiple times. Even after collapsing, with her hands still gripping the blanket over her chest, she was shot again, as if the killer wanted to make sure she had no chance to survive, or worse, was unleashing pure rage. Susan was treated as the primary target, while John, shot twice, was left barely alive, one dead, one living, but with no memory, no testimony. In the investigation report, officers described the scene repeatedly with one phrase, execution style. Not a robbery, not an accident, but a death sentence that had been premeditated. From that moment on, the case was transferred from patrol to Miami-Dade's homicide division. And for the investigators, the goal wasn't just to find the killer, but the reason, because clearly, what killed Susan wasn't just the bullet, but a chain of smoldering events. And that night was just the end. The next morning, when John Sutton woke from his medically induced coma, he saw nothing but darkness. The bullet had damaged both retinas, leaving him permanently blind. He couldn't remember anything, couldn't describe the attacker, couldn't even believe his wife was dead. "I couldn't go to the funeral," John would later say. "I couldn't hug anyone. I just knew my world had disappeared." His first question after hearing of Susan's death was, did the police find anything? Not, who did this? Not, why her? But any clues? Such a question could be a sign of composure, or something else. Colder. But to understand why a devoted wife like Susan died in the very house she once lovingly decorated, why her blood stained her pillow, Why it all ended with a bullet in the dead of night. We have to go back, not 24 hours, but 30 days, when death began creeping into every dinner, every call, every glance, unnoticed by all. Susan Sutton was not an anonymous victim. She was not just a name in a forensics report or a newspaper headline. She was a real person, a woman who had lived, who had loved, who had sacrificed for the small family she believed to be the safest place in her world. She was born in a small town in Florida, raised in a Catholic family, praised from a young age for being gentle, obedient, and so patient it made others feel guilty. Susan studied accounting and later became a legal secretary, a job she devoted herself to for nearly 20 years, at her husband John Sutton's law office, where she managed everything from meals to contracts to paperclips for him. Whenever a new employee arrived, she was always the first to stand up with a smile and say, "Let me help," when they fumbled with the photocopier. Susan had a way of caring for people that required no praise. She never spoke of what she did, never needed anyone to know she had stayed late to bake cookies for a sick friend, or that she had reversed out of a parking lot just to bring a food box to a homeless person sitting under a streetlight in the rain. For Susan, helping others was as natural as breathing. No need for affirmation, no need for recognition. To her husband, Susan was always yielding, always trusting. Even amid disagreements, she chose peace over arguments. She once told her sister, "He's the logical one. I'm the one who keeps the flame alive." Keeping the flame was how she described her patience in a marriage that wasn't always tender. John could be curt and cold, but Susan never walked away, never declined a dinner with him, even if dinner meant sitting in silence. But perhaps what made Susan most special in the eyes of those around her wasn't her competence or resourcefulness. It was the way she mothered. She never gave birth, but she was a mother in the most devoted way a woman could be. Christopher Sutton was adopted as an infant, and from the moment she held him in her arms, Susan believed he was the greatest gift of her life. She cared for him through every meal, every night's sleep, every homework assignment, every messy drawing pinned proudly to the living room wall. She attended parent-teacher meetings, showed up at every school play, and was always the first to applaud when Chris appeared on stage, even if he was just a blade of grass. Neighbors recalled how every morning Susan would prepare a lunchbox for Christopher, even when he grew up and no longer needed it. She still left it out of habit, out of a small hope that her son still needed her. Family members said she would sit for hours in the dark on nights when Chris slammed his bedroom door in anger, then quietly knock, leaving behind a glass of milk and a note that read, "Mom is always here." But that love, the love that defined Susan, was also what blinded her. She didn't see the changes happening in her son, or if she did, she refused to believe they were dangerous. Susan once told her husband, "He's rebellious because he's smart. He needs freedom. He'll be fine." Even when Christopher began spiraling, getting involved with drugs, dropping out of school, disobeying, she still said, "He's just lost. He'll come back." Susan believed that love could fix anything, and perhaps that belief stopped her from seeing the abyss opening right in her own home. She loved to the point of self-sacrifice, gave unconditionally, and it was because of that she became someone no one could save. In Coral Gables, where the Suttons lived, people knew Susan. They called her the woman who always smiled, the one who brought pastries on Sunday mornings, the one who greeted me on my jogs. They didn't see a victim. They saw a part of their community, someone who made the neighborhood a little warmer, a little gentler. She was the kind of person who handwrote birthday cards for every colleague, who bought packs of tissues for the office just because everyone seems to have a cold lately. Someone who moved through life without noise, leaving only a lingering ache, a quiet longing. And that's why her death, right in her bed, in the very home that was supposed to be her sanctuary, was not just a crime, but a loss. A shock that made everyone who had ever crossed paths with Susan see the world a little differently. People say death makes us remember the kindness we've forgotten, and Susan's death somehow made the entire Coral Gables community stop and ask, how could someone like that be murdered? And more importantly, who could do that to someone like her? Susan Sutton's final month didn't begin with a tragedy. There was no defining incident, no clear warning. Just a sequence of subtle changes, so minor that no one noticed, disjointed puzzle pieces that seemed unrelated until they assembled into a blood-soaked picture on the night of August 19, 2004. During the first week, Susan still went to the office regularly, still did the grocery shopping, still called her sister every Wednesday afternoon as usual. But neighbors began to notice her taking evening walks, something she had never done before. Susan used to never step outside after 7 p.m., partly because she hated mosquitoes, partly because she cherished the safety of her familiar kitchen. Yet that week, for 3 consecutive nights, she walked slowly around the neighborhood, carrying nothing but her phone and a pen. Sometimes she would stop under a street lamp, jot something into her palm, and then wipe it away. When someone asked, "What are you doing?" she smiled. "Walking helps me sleep." Oops. But her eyes didn't look like someone chasing sleep. They looked like someone trying to drown out a sound in her head, a persistent, hazy noise. By the second week, Susan had stopped turning on the home answering machine, something only the regular flower delivery man noticed. He usually left a cheerful birthday message for her every year. This time the machine was off, the door unopened, the bouquet left neatly on the porch, but no thank you card came, as it always did. At the same time, a shift crept into her daily routine. Every morning before leaving for work, Susan would leave a small note on the kitchen table listing her to-dos. Buy carrots. Call insurance. Book restaurant for birthday. But that week, John found a crumpled handwritten note instead, with just one line. If anyone asks, say I went to bed early. It didn't look rushed. There was no period. Just a neat little line that made him pause for a few seconds, unsure why it sent a chill down his spine. In the third week, the oddities became clearer. Susan moved to sleep in the living room. The reason was familiar. John's snoring, a long-standing issue, but this time was different. She brought her own pillow, her own nightlight, even added an interior bolt to the door. She didn't allow the housekeeper to clean that room, saying only, "I want to do it myself." On one rare occasion, John saw her lock the door from the inside, in broad daylight. Outwardly, life continued as normal. Susan still went to the office, still joined co-workers for lunch, still put her arm around new hires and said, "Take your time, you'll get the hang of it." But her gaze had changed. She occasionally glanced up at the hallway cameras as if checking something. Once she came home early without explanation, sat motionless on the sofa for over an hour, with no lights on, no TV, just stillness, as if waiting for something to happen, something she couldn't name. The final week was when the strangeness became undeniable. Susan began cooking more, not for her family, but for neighbors. For 3 consecutive days, she brought pastries to the house next door, left a small gift box at the door of a former coworker of John's, even sent a bag of fruit to the hospital where her mother-in-law had once been treated. No one understood why. She only said one thing to a market vendor: "Some people need to be reminded that they were once cared for." That evening, she wrote a small note and left it on the dining table. 7 p.m. Thursday, family only. It was for her 57th birthday dinner. The main dish was Southwestern-style salad, her favorite since youth. Attendees included John, Christopher, Christopher's girlfriend Juliet, and Teddy, John's colleague and close friend. The dinner passed in an eerie quiet. Susan smiled a lot, spoke little. Her eyes lingered on her son's face longer than usual. At one point, she stopped mid-sentence when she caught Juliet's gaze. Just a split second, but enough to make her drop her spoon. When Teddy said goodbye at 9:30, Susan walked him to the door, then remained standing in the dark for nearly a minute, her hand gripping the railing as if forcing herself to hold together something that had just shattered inside. At 10 p.m. she retreated to her room, not saying goodnight, not locking the door like she had on previous nights, but leaving it ajar, just a sliver, as if expecting someone to come in. As if she knew what was coming, just not when. And then, true to the way death arrives in the most unexpected crimes, silently, cleanly, without warning. But if anyone were to look back at Susan's last month, every step, every glance, every tiny mental fracture, they would realize She had felt it coming all along. It's just that no one could believe someone like Susan could be murdered. In her own home. By the very person she once held in her arms and called son. And the first person to arrive at the scene wasn't a neighbor, nor a passing patrol officer. It was Teddy Montoto, John Sutton's associate, a close friend to both husband and wife, someone who had shared many dinners with the family, and whom Susan trusted enough to call John's brother, but not by blood. Teddy claimed that he had just left their house a little over an hour after the birthday dinner when he received a call from Susan. During the conversation, he said he heard a loud noise, like a bang or a gunshot, and then the call abruptly ended. He couldn't reach her again, so, worried, he drove back to check. By the time he arrived, the police had already cordoned off the area. The story sounded plausible, but something about it didn't sit right. First, why would Susan call Teddy so late at night, just under an hour after saying goodbye? And if it was something urgent, why not call her husband or wait until the next morning at the office? Then, when police asked whether he'd recently handled any weapons, Teddy voluntarily disclosed that he frequently practiced shooting and, in fact, had been at the shooting range that same afternoon, which could explain gunpowder residue on his hands. That detail, instead of deflecting suspicion, only raised more red flags. Most people don't volunteer incriminating information unless they're trying to steer the investigation. While police were still processing the scene, John Sutton, barely conscious after emerging from a coma and without memory of the incident, asked a chilling question. Did the police find anything in the house? Not where's Susan, not what happened. But did they find anything? His gaze, though clouded, was fixed on the hospital bed as if calculating something he couldn't put into words. Some said it was the reaction of a seasoned attorney, someone who had handled hundreds of cases and always thought in terms of evidence. Others believed it was the reaction of someone with something to hide. And when John was finally told that Susan had died, he didn't cry, didn't ask to see her one last time. He simply said, "I won't be able to attend the funeral." That was true. He was blind, injured, confined to a hospital, but the way he said it was eerily calm, as if the grief had been pre-processed. Meanwhile, suspicion began to turn toward their only son, Christopher Sutton, who had attended the birthday dinner with his girlfriend, Juliet Driscoll. Both claimed they left the house at 9 p.m. to see a movie, arrived at the theater by 9:30, watched a film from 10 p.m. until just before midnight, and then went home to sleep. This alibi was supported by theater security footage, but one tiny detail, noticed only by a seasoned investigator, stood out. The moment Christopher stepped out of the theater, he immediately pulled out his phone and made a call, just seconds after exiting. It was a move that felt too quick, too urgent, unlike how people typically act after a movie. Most would say things like, "Wasn't that good? Where to next? Ready to crash?" But Christopher said nothing to Juliet, just made a call. That call lasted 43 seconds. Upon reviewing phone records, police found that in the 5 weeks leading up to the murder, Christopher had called the same number 162 times, over 3 times per day on average. The recipient was Garrett Kopp, a drifter with no job, a petty criminal with a record for theft, living in Homestead, about 20 miles from the Sutton home. Garrett had once done odd jobs around the house. Plumbing, garage cleaning. No one in the family thought highly of him. John had said, "That guy's not trustworthy." Susan had urged her son to cut ties. But Christopher stayed in contact, and even asked Garrett to rip out all the carpet from his bedroom the day after the murder. The reason? The blood and the smell were unbearable. Yet he refused to hire professional cleaners. Why ask someone with a criminal record, someone who once told friends, "I'll be rich soon"? And why did Christopher, raised with love, given good schools, a car, forgiveness for all his missteps, feel the need to call this man immediately after leaving the theater? There were no clear answers, only a growing unease. Behind all the logical, coherent statements were threads that didn't quite match. Juliet, Christopher's girlfriend, initially claimed to know nothing, insisting Garrett was just the handyman. But after 10 relentless hours of interrogation, with no breaks, no access to a lawyer, her tone changed. Her eyes red, hands clenched, lips tight whenever Susan's name came up. Then, through broken breath, she said one sentence. "Susan was like a real mother to me. I can't keep quiet anymore." And with that sentence, the silence began to collapse. In the widening circle of suspicion, no one stood outside it. Everyone, from the associate to the husband to the son, had a motive, had secrets, had said things that, while reasonable on the surface, sent chills upon closer inspection. And in a family murder case, the scariest thing isn't the absence of clues, but the fact that so many familiar faces are lying. Christopher Sutton didn't grow up in poverty. He wasn't abandoned. He wasn't a street orphan or a victim of abuse. He was adopted as a newborn and raised with the full love of a gentle, nurturing mother and a successful, stern but responsible father. He had his own room, his own car, attended private school, vacationed every summer, and celebrated birthdays at restaurants most children only saw through the window. But that was just the surface. Beneath it, from a very early age, Christopher was a boy full of contradictions, a child loved too much, yet incapable of loving back. Susan believed her son was simply a little too strong-willed, that every teenager is difficult. John thought he needs stricter discipline, so together they decided to send Christopher to a strict boarding school in Samoa when he was 17. That school, according to former classmates, didn't feel like a rehab center. It felt more like a prison disguised as education. Students were forced to obey without question, and any deviance led to isolation, a concrete room without windows, phones, or lights. Christopher was locked in there for hours once, simply for disobedience. From that room he rode home, not begging to be taken back, but threatening. "If you don't pull me out of this place, I'll take matters into my own hands." Susan's hands shook as she read it, but John quietly folded the letter, called a lawyer, and had the court extend Christopher's placement until he completed the program. From that moment, in Christopher's eyes, his parents were no longer caregivers. They were traitors, people who had sold him out to a cruel system. He began nurturing the belief that he had been robbed of his right to control his own life. Christopher didn't believe in unconditional love, didn't believe in forgiveness, didn't buy into the idea that parents do it for your own good. In his experience, the people who loved you most could also punish you the hardest. When he returned from Samoa, Christopher appeared normal again. He went to school, had a girlfriend, even helped out at his father's law office. But internally, he was no longer the same. He no longer called Susan Mom, never said "I love you" like he used to. His gaze toward John always carried a suppressed layer of resentment, subtle enough to go unnoticed, but always present. A neighbor once said, "I saw Christopher walking his dog, and when the dog kept pulling toward the house, he yanked the leash hard, not like a correction, but like punishment. I thought it was just irritation, but now I'm not so sure." Because small behaviors, when repeated long enough, can reveal a pattern of psychological control. Christopher controlled Juliet, his girlfriend, with silence. Not with shouting or jealousy, but with absence. He'd disappear from conversations whenever she disobeyed him, only to return hours later with tenderness, as if nothing happened, leaving her in a constant state of trying to predict his moods. That's how manipulators work. Quietly, persistently. Not by yelling, but by making others afraid of their disappointment. In the same way, Chris groomed Garrett Kopp, a vulnerable, drifting young man with a child, legal debts, and no steady job. Garrett wasn't a professional killer. He was someone easily manipulated, without a plan, without a strong moral compass. And Christopher knew that. He knew exactly what to say, and when to say it, to push someone who just wanted to be seen into pulling a trigger. "If you don't do it, I will. And if I do, you'll die too." That's what Garrett told investigators Christopher said to him. Not out of remorse, but fear. Fear of losing his child, of facing execution, of having no leverage left. But the more terrifying part was Christopher's planning. Cold, calculated, without emotion or ethical hesitation. He knew his parents slept in separate rooms. He knew the rear glass door could be pried open. He knew exactly when everyone would leave the house. He created an alibi by going to a movie, knew its runtime, and timed everything to make a confirming call the moment it ended. That wasn't a crime of passion, it was a deliberate erasure. A murder meant to secure freedom, inheritance, a life no longer managed. What horrified investigators wasn't just that Christopher killed, it was that he killed his own mother, the one person who still believed he'll turn out okay, and did so without a trace of emotional reaction afterward. No tears, no panic, no justification, just subtle nods and a steady gaze, like he hadn't killed anyone, only crossed out an obstacle in his personal plan. A court-appointed psychologist testified, "Not everyone who kills is insane. Sometimes it's just someone whose selfishness has outgrown their capacity for love. And in this case, that selfishness was so large, it drowned an entire family." The lingering question isn't why Christopher did it. We've seen all the puzzle pieces align to form a reason. The question is, why didn't anyone in the family see it coming? Or did they see it and still believe that family ties were strong enough to stop someone from falling apart? Susan believed that, and she was wrong. There were no screams in the interrogation room, no loud accusations, no fists slamming down on the table like in a crime film, just a young man with swollen eyes from sleeplessness, hands trembling with sweat and fear, and a recording over 3 hours long. In it, Garrett Kopp, the one who pulled the trigger, finally admitted what everyone had long suspected, but no one had dared confirm. "I did it. I shot them." The words came out so faintly that the tape had to be replayed just to be sure he'd confessed. But what left the investigators silent wasn't the confession, it was what came next. "Chris said if I didn't do it, he'd kill me. And my kid." In that moment, no one in the room believed Garrett was the mastermind anymore. The truth became as clear as sunlight slipping through a curtain. It was Christopher Sutton who had loaded the first bullet. Not with his hands, but with his words, his manipulation, his relentless phone calls over a month-long campaign of pressure. It was a system of promises and threats that pushed a drifting young man like Garrett to believe there was no way out except to become a killer. When Juliet, Christopher's girlfriend, sat in the interrogation room, she didn't make eye contact. She stared down at her hands, twisting her thumbs until her skin began to bleed. No yelling, no handcuffs, no slammed doors. Just 3 precise questions and a silence long enough to crush the breath from her chest. And then she began to talk. About the times Chris said his mother didn't deserve to live, about how he said if his parents died, he'd have everything. She told them about the phone call near midnight that night, how he said just one thing to someone on the other end. "It's done." Just 2 words, no emotion, no follow-up. But in that context, it hit like a death sentence. When police traced the entire phone record, they discovered that around the time Garrett claimed to have left the scene, approximately 10:50 p.m., Chris's phone began to vibrate repeatedly. There were 3 calls in under 5 minutes, all from the same number. Each call lasted only seconds, but they were enough to confirm the act was complete, to say "job done," or to erase the final traces of hesitation in both their minds. When Christopher was summoned for questioning, he didn't act afraid. He didn't flee. He didn't get angry. In fact, he asked calmly, "Should I bring a lawyer?" A response so composed it even threw the investigators off momentarily. But when they placed Juliet's signed statement in front of him, his eyes shifted. For the first time during the session, he lowered his head. And after a few minutes of silence, he cried. Not from remorse, but from being caught. In court, the prosecution laid out all the evidence. The calls, the testimonies, the security footage, the phone logs, the killer's confession, and above all, the intimate details only someone inside the house would know. Details Garrett described with eerie accuracy, the direction of the bedrooms, the sliding back door, even the exact placement of Susan's bedside lamp. Before the jury, Christopher maintained his innocence. He sat quietly, occasionally whispering to his lawyer, unmoved when photographs of his mother's body were shown, unfazed as the medical examiner described her wounds. 3 bullets, fired from less than a meter away. 2 to the chest, 1 to the arm as she tried to shield her face. Only once did Christopher react. He turned toward his father, John Sutton, who sat in the gallery with sightless eyes, and asked, almost as if talking in his sleep, "Do you believe them?" No one answered. John didn't move, didn't nod, didn't shake his head. He just sat there as if the words had run out long ago. Christopher was sentenced to life without parole. Garrett Kopp, due to his cooperation, received 30 years. But the sentence didn't end the story. Because what remains can't be filed in a court record. The lingering question, if at some moment in the past Susan had noticed, if John had asked more questions, if someone had listened, would things have turned out differently? They say justice was served. But that justice didn't bring Susan back, didn't let John see his son's face one last time, didn't comfort him during the long nights he lay in bed reaching into empty space, calling the name of the wife he thought he'd grow old with. And maybe the most terrifying thing isn't the verdict, but the truth that sometimes the cracks in a family are so small we ignore them, until they're deep enough to not just kill a person, but destroy the belief that our home will always be the safest place in the world. The Susan Sutton case ended with a severe sentence. But for many, the story is only beginning. A story of a once complete family, now shattered. Of a mother who believed love was enough. And of a son, loved more than most, who chose to kill the only person who first called him son. Is there a limit to hatred in a human heart? Or, sometimes, do people kill not because they were unloved, but because they never learned how to be grateful? Cold Radio. Thanks you for staying until the end of this story. And if, after all this, you still believe that the truth always finds the light, then maybe you're the last person holding on to the best part of a world full of loss.